Pirate life was absolutely nothing like the glamorous Hollywood movies full of shiny gold and epic sword fights on tropical beaches. The daily reality of sailing under the black flag was a bizarre nightmare of toxic stenches, fermented urine laundry, and bureaucratic rules so incredibly strict they would make a modern accountant sweat. We are about to completely ruin your childhood maritime fantasies with 44 insane, disgusting, and utterly absurd realities of being a real historical outlaw of the sea. 1. Picture the most disgusting locker room you have ever entered, then multiply that by 1,000 and add the smell of rotting livestock. That was the daily reality of life on a pirate ship, where dozens of unwashed men were packed into a damp wooden hull with zero ventilation. Since fresh water was too precious to be wasted on something as silly as a shower, everyone just marinated in a cocktail of old sweat, sea salt, and whatever filth they picked up in the last port. To make things even more charming, the bilge water at the bottom of the ship was essentially a toxic soup of leaking sewage and dead rats that produced fumes so thick they could literally knock a man unconscious. You weren't sailing toward a tropical paradise, you were basically trapped in a floating dumpster. 2. Doing laundry on a pirate ship involved a cleaning hack so incredibly disgusting that wearing dirty clothes actually seemed like a fantastic alternative. Since they did not have fresh water or soap, sailors would collect their own urine in giant wooden buckets, let it sit in the hot sun until it fermented, and then wash their clothes in it. The ammonia in the stale liquid actually bleached the stains out of their nasty linen shirts, but it left them smelling exactly like a giant floating public restroom. When a fearsome pirate proudly marched into port, he was literally wearing an outfit completely soaked in old human waste. 3. The most terrifying disease on a pirate ship literally made your old scars magically unzip themselves and fall apart. Scurvy was caused by a total lack of vitamin C, turning hardened criminals into giant weeping babies whose teeth would randomly drop out mid-conversation. You could be casually chatting with your buddy, and suddenly his front tooth is swimming in his rum. Because their diet was mostly stale biscuits and dried meat, their bodies basically forgot how to produce the biological glue holding humans together. Imagine being a feared outlaw of the sea, only to be completely defeated because you refused to eat a single orange for 6 months straight. 4. Using the bathroom on a pirate galleon was an extreme sport that required the balance of a gymnast and zero sense of dignity. The toilet was literally just a wooden board with a hole cut in it, strapped to the very front of the ship directly over the crashing waves. This area was called the head, and if you had to go during a rough storm, you had to cling to the rigging for dear life while the ocean violently splashed freezing salt water right up your backside. There was no privacy, no toilet paper, and a very real chance of slipping on the wet wood and falling into the sea with your pants down. 5. If you got a nasty cut during a boarding party, your best-case scenario was a quick death, because pirate medicine was basically a horror movie with no budget. Since real doctors preferred not to be hanged for piracy, the surgeon was usually the ship's cook or the carpenter because they were the only ones who owned sharp saws and didn't mind the sight of blood. There was no anesthesia, no sterile tools, and definitely no hand washing. If your leg looked infected, Cookie would just pour a splash of cheap rum on the wound, hand you a leather strap to bite on, and hack through your bone as fast as his rusty blade could go. 6. Your morning bowl of cereal looks like a royal feast compared to the nightmare fuel pirates called breakfast. They survived on hardtack, a biscuit so incredibly dense that sailors often broke their teeth just trying to take a bite without soaking it in beer first. But the real flavor came from the weevils and maggots that called these crackers home. Instead of throwing the infested food away, pirates would just eat in the dark so they wouldn't have to watch the bugs squirming between their fingers. On a long voyage, they would even resort to boiling their own leather boots just to have something to chew on. 7. Rocking a leather eye patch had absolutely nothing to do with losing an eyeball in a glamorous sword fight. It was actually a genius piece of biological hacking used by sailors who constantly needed to run between the blinding sunshine on the upper deck and the pitch-black storage hull below. By keeping one eye permanently covered, it stayed perfectly adjusted to the dark. The moment a pirate went under the deck, they simply flipped the patch to the other side and could instantly see in the gloomy shadows without tripping over barrels. These rough sailors essentially invented a primitive version of night vision goggles using a scrap of old cowhide and some string. 8. When it came to intimidation tactics, some pirates went to completely absurd lengths to look like literal demons, taking their morning beverages to toxic new levels. The legendary Blackbeard was famous for mixing large amounts of raw explosive gunpowder right into his daily mug of rum and then lighting the whole thing on fire before drinking it down. He would sit there chugging this sparkling, highly poisonous chemical cocktail in front of his prisoners just to prove how completely unhinged he was. This bizarre party trick probably caused massive internal organ damage, but it succeeded in making everyone believe he was an immortal monster. 9. For guys who faced down massive hurricanes and Navy warships on a daily basis, pirates were absolutely terrified of bananas. This yellow fruit was considered the ultimate bad luck charm, and bringing even a single banana onto a pirate ship could literally cause a mutiny. They believed bananas caused ships to sink, spoiled the other food, and somehow secretly invited dangerous storms to destroy them. If a captain caught a sailor trying to sneak a tropical fruit snack on board, he would probably throw the fruit and the guy right into the ocean. It is incredibly funny to picture heavily armed outlaws trembling in fear at the sight of a completely harmless potassium snack. 10. Getting a tattoo as a pirate was not about looking tough. It was an absolutely bizarre insurance policy against drowning that relied on terrible animal logic. Sailors would get a tattoo of a pig on one foot and a rooster on the other, because those animals were famously bad at swimming and hated the water. They genuinely believed the ocean would look at their feet, see the farm animals, and quickly spit them back onto dry land to avoid them. You had these heavily scarred, dangerous outlaws walking around with cute barnyard animals inked on their toes, firmly convinced that a drawing of a chicken was a scientifically proven substitute for a life jacket. 11. Forget the epic sword fights and cinematic cannon duels, because the most dangerous enemy a pirate ever faced was a tiny, buzzing mosquito. More pirate crews were decimated by yellow fever and malaria than by the entire British Royal Navy combined. Because they spent months in tropical heat with zero understanding of basic sanitation, a single infected sailor could turn a 100-man crew into a collection of yellow-skinned corpses in less than 2 weeks. Imagine being trapped in a humid, cramped cabin while your friends are literally vomiting black blood, and there is absolutely nothing you can do but wait for your turn. 12. Maintaining a massive pirate ship required the most tedious and humiliating chore imaginable, which was a deeply exhausting process known as careening. These terrifying sea bandits had to occasionally park their giant vessel on a muddy, hidden beach, tip it completely onto its side, and spend weeks manually scraping thousands of sharp, crusty barnacles off the wooden hull. If they skipped this incredibly boring duty, the heavy sea bugs and thick weeds would slow the ship down so much that even a sluggish cargo vessel could easily outrun them. You had heavily armed legendary outlaws reduced to acting like disgruntled janitors getting eaten alive by sandflies. 13. The strict ban on women coming aboard a pirate vessel had absolutely nothing to do with running an exclusive boys' club, but rather because they thought the ocean was wildly jealous. According to intense nautical superstition, a ship was considered a female entity, and bringing a real human woman on board would make the wooden boat so incredibly angry that it would intentionally sink itself in a fit of rage. These fearless outlaws who regularly robbed international armadas were terrified that their own sailing vessel would throw a massive emotional tantrum and drown them all just because a lady stepped onto the deck. 14. The rats on a pirate ship were so unbelievably aggressive and massive that they practically acted as the real captains of the vessel. These giant, fearless rodents completely ignored the crew, frequently marching across the deck in broad daylight and openly stealing dry biscuits right out of the hands of very confused sailors. When the tired crew finally went to sleep in their extremely cramped hammocks, the rats would literally try to chew the thick, salty calluses off the bottoms of their bare feet. You could be a notoriously dangerous rebel, but you still had to sleep holding a heavy wooden club just to fight off fuzzy little monsters eating your toes. 15. If you think pirates wearing dark makeup is just a theatrical invention to make them look edgy, you are completely mistaken. They actually smeared thick black soot and crushed minerals all around their eyes to cut down on the blinding glare of the sun reflecting off the ocean. Instead of doing this to look like terrifying monsters of the deep, it was a purely practical survival tactic to stop them from going permanently blind while staring at the sparkling water all day. So, a full crew of heavily armed pirates storming a ship probably looked like they were wearing incredibly dramatic stage makeup while committing acts of treason. 16. The absolute ultimate nightmare for a pirate crew was not a massive sea battle. It was actually a terrifying weather phenomenon where absolutely nothing happened at all. Getting stuck in the doldrums meant the ocean wind completely died, and the ship just sat motionless on a glassy sea for weeks on end. The crew would be trapped with 60 incredibly smelly men in the blistering tropical heat, slowly going completely out of their minds from sheer boredom while waiting for a single breeze. Their food would spoil, their drinking water would turn into a slimy green sludge, and they would just stare endlessly at a completely flat horizon. 17. Sleeping arrangements on a pirate vessel were a cramped nightmare that made a tiny prison cell look like a luxury palace. Most of the crew had to sleep in hammocks that were squeezed so tightly together that you were basically touching shoulders with a sweaty, snoring stranger every single night. Because space was at a premium, these hammocks were often hung directly over the barrels of food or the cannons. And when the ship rocked in the waves, you would frequently bump into the person next to you like a human pendulum. There was zero privacy and a constant struggle for an inch of personal space that simply did not exist. 18. The concept of a pirate wedding was a bizarre and surprisingly organized arrangement known as matelotage that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with insurance. Because their lives were so unpredictable, two pirates would often form a legal partnership where they shared all their gold, weapons, and even their clothes while they were alive. If one of them died in a scuffle or from a freak accident involving a falling coconut, the other partner inherited everything they owned automatically. It was a practical way to make sure your hard-earned loot didn't just vanish into the sea or get snatched by a greedy captain. 19. The toughest and most heavily armed criminals on the ocean were absolutely paralyzed by the sound of someone whistling a cheerful tune. Pirates genuinely believed that whistling on a ship would anger the wind gods and magically summon a massive hurricane to destroy them all. You could be a legendary outlaw with a dozen pistols strapped to your chest, but if you started whistling a little melody while mopping the deck, your entire crew would tackle you to the ground in sheer panic. It is incredibly funny to imagine a ship full of hardened sea bandits aggressively shushing each other just because someone pursed their lips. 20. You might picture a pirate captain as an absolute dictator who ruled with an iron fist, but pirate ships were actually more democratic than most governments of their time. The crew literally voted to elect their captain, and if the guy in charge started making bad decisions, hoarding the good food, or just acting like a jerk, they could instantly vote him right out of office. This meant the scariest, most intimidating pirates on the ocean were basically politicians who had to constantly kiss up to their crew to keep their jobs. If a captain lost an election mid-voyage, he just had to grab a mop and go back to scrubbing the decks. 21. Hoisting the famous skull and crossbones flag was usually the very last thing a pirate ship did during a chase on the open sea. For 99% of the voyage, they were basically committing international identity theft by flying the friendly flags of whatever country they were sailing near. They kept massive chests full of different national banners, raising a Spanish or British flag to look completely harmless and trick wealthy merchant ships into letting them get incredibly close. They only swapped to the terrifying black pirate flag at the exact moment it was too late for the victim to escape. 22. Being a fearless rebel of the seas came with a surprisingly strict bedtime that would make a rigid boarding school look relaxed. Most pirate codes legally demanded that all candles, lanterns, and smoking pipes below deck be completely extinguished by 8 o'clock at night. Since the entire ship was made of dry wood, coated in highly flammable pitch and packed to the brim with explosive gunpowder, a single clumsy sailor dropping a candle could blow the entire crew into the sky. If you wanted to stay up late drinking rum and telling stories, you had to do it outside on the freezing, wet upper deck in the pitch dark. 23. The real boss on a pirate ship was not the guy wearing the fancy captain hat. It was an elected official called the quartermaster, who basically acted as the ultimate complaint department. While the captain only had total control during an actual battle, the quartermaster ran the day-to-day life, deciding how much food everyone got, dividing up the stolen loot, and settling petty arguments between cranky sailors. If you felt you were being treated unfairly, you took your complaints to this guy, and he had the power to override the captain on almost any daily issue. 24. Legendary stories absolutely lied to you about pirates forcing their enemies to dramatically walk off a wooden plank into the ocean. That practice was incredibly rare, mostly because real pirates had a much more psychologically devastating punishment called marooning. If you broke the rules or crossed the crew, they would simply drop you off on a tiny deserted sandbar in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a single bottle of water and a loaded pistol. You were left completely alone to slowly lose your mind under the baking sun, making the idea of a quick drop into the ocean seem like a luxurious alternative. 25. It is time to kill the myth that pirates were financial geniuses burying treasure chests on every random beach. In reality, most of the booty they captured was incredibly boring bulk cargo, like massive rolls of wet tobacco, crates of industrial wax, or barrels of sticky molasses. You can't exactly go to a tavern and pay for a round of drinks with a 60-pound bag of raw wool. Pirates were almost always broke because they had to find shady traders in port who would buy their stolen junk for a tiny fraction of its actual worth. Whatever silver they did get was usually spent within 48 hours on gambling and cheap booze. 26. We really need to address the massive elephant in the room, because the classic pirate accent with all the exaggerated rolling sounds is a total fabrication. If you traveled back in time and spoke like that to a real pirate, they would look at you like you were utterly insane. That entire accent was invented by theatrical actors centuries later to sound more dramatic, and everyone just blindly copied it forever. Real pirates sounded like completely average guys from random coastal towns in England or farming villages in Scotland. The most ruthless sea bandits in history probably sounded exactly like an average grumpy fisherman. 27. Wearing a shiny gold hoop earring was not just a bizarre fashion statement to look cool, it was basically magical pirate acupuncture. These guys genuinely believed that piercing their earlobes with precious metals would instantly cure extreme seasickness or prevent them from going deaf when firing loud cannons. It was a completely unscientific superstition, except they were also hoping the gold would pay for a proper funeral if they washed up on a random beach. So those intimidating earrings were essentially just a desperate insurance policy mixed with incredibly bad medicine to stop them from puking over the railing. 28. Becoming a professional pirate required a shocking amount of boring paperwork that felt more like taking out a bank loan than joining a criminal gang. Before a ship left the dock, every single crew member had to sign a massive legal document called the Pirate Code, which detailed exactly how the stolen goods would be split. It was basically an ironclad contract with strict terms and conditions, meaning you had to agree to all the rules before you were legally allowed to steal anything. These guys were committing acts of treason but still insisted on proper bureaucratic signatures and a legally binding compensation package. 29. The absolute most terrifying symbol in nautical history, the Black Pirate flag, actually evolved from a name that sounds incredibly delicate. The legendary Jolly Roger was originally a solid red flag flown by French privateers to signal they would show zero mercy, which they called the Joli Rouge, meaning pretty red. English pirates completely butchered the pronunciation because they were terrible at foreign languages, turning pretty red into Jolly Roger. So the ultimate symbol of fear and rebellion that sent shivers down the spines of naval admirals was entirely based on a massive, embarrassing mispronunciation. 30. Having long, greasy hair was not just an aesthetic choice to look rebellious. It was a giant fire hazard that required heavily weaponized hairstyling. Since they worked around open flames and exploding black powder, pirates had to tie their hair back in tight braids and coat it with sticky tar just to stop their heads from catching on fire. This thick layer of ship tar essentially turned their ponytails into rock-solid, waterproof helmets that felt like actual tree bark. Imagine going months without a shower while your hair is permanently glued together with industrial roof sealant. 31. Drinking water on a pirate ship was so unbelievably disgusting that everyone from the captain to the cabin boy spent the entire voyage in a state of mild intoxication just to survive. Fresh water stored in wooden barrels quickly turned into a putrid algae soup filled with black slime in the Caribbean heat. To make this liquid swamp water drinkable, they mixed it with heavy doses of rum and lime juice to create a concoction called grog. The goal wasn't just to party. It was to chemically kill the funk in the water so they wouldn't violently vomit from the first sip. 32. Pirates had a very strange obsession with exotic pets that often turned their ships into floating, unregulated zoos filled with confused tropical animals. While everyone expects a parrot on the shoulder, these guys were actually bringing back monkeys, iguanas, and even small crocodiles just because they could. These animals weren't just for company, they were valuable trade items that could be sold for a high price back in Europe. However, having a dozen monkeys swinging from the rigging and stealing the crew's food created a level of chaos that made an already difficult job almost impossible. 33. The pirate code of conduct was surprisingly strict about things you would never expect, like preventing the crew from playing dice for money. Captains knew that gambling led to massive fistfights and broken friendships, so they often banned it entirely to keep the peace during long stretches at sea. Instead of losing their gold in a game, pirates had to find other ways to settle their differences, which usually involved very loud arguments in front of the whole crew. It is a weird paradox that the people famous for breaking every law on land were incredibly disciplined about who could play board games. 34. Finding your way across the ocean was less about scientific precision and more about literally blinding yourself on a daily basis. Before modern tools, sailors used a primitive device called a cross staff to measure the angle of the sun, which literally required staring directly into the blazing solar glare until their retinas burned. Since their paper charts were mostly rough sketches full of errors, they often had no idea where they were and would just sail in circles hoping to hit land. The people navigating these deadly warships were often half-blind men, squinting at bad drawings, hoping a random bird would fly by to point them toward a continent. 35. The standard pirate dress code was basically a chaotic explosion of stolen high fashion that made them look like confused peacocks rather than scary criminals. Since they couldn't exactly go shopping, they just threw on whatever they found in the luggage of wealthy passengers they robbed. You would see a rugged, scarred sailor wearing a pink silk ladies' corset over a dirty linen shirt, paired with a giant feathered hat and stolen velvet breeches that were 3 sizes too small. They loved bright colors and expensive fabrics because it was a direct insult to the strict laws of the time that forbade poor people from wearing fancy clothes. 36. Entertainment at sea was so desperately boring that pirates invented some of the most absurd and chaotic games just to keep from losing their minds. One favorite pastime involved everyone sitting in a circle in the dark and taking turns hitting each other with large wooden spoons until someone guessed who did it. Another bizarre tradition was the mock trial, where they would dress up in ridiculous costumes and hold a fake court session to prosecute a crew member for something entirely stupid. These sessions usually ended in everyone falling over laughing, proving that even the most nonsensical activities become the highlight of your existence at sea. 37. Every pirate ship desperately needed entertainment, which meant that capturing a guy who knew how to play the fiddle was basically like finding a chest full of gold. Musicians were the most protected people on the ocean because they provided the only relief from boredom, meaning they were legally exempt from doing any heavy lifting or gross chores. During a massive sea battle, the ship's band was forced to stand on the upper deck and aggressively play their heavy wooden instruments to terrify the enemy, creating a chaotic tavern brawl atmosphere with actual cannons. 38. The pirate code of Brotherhood was so incredibly intense that putting a simple padlock on your personal storage chest was considered an unforgivable insult to the entire crew. Since they prided themselves on being a brotherhood of thieves who shared everything equally, locking your stuff up meant you secretly thought your best friends were going to steal from your stash. If you were caught putting a lock on your footlocker, the crew would take it as a massive sign of disrespect and probably throw your entire chest directly into the ocean to teach you a lesson about trust. 39. Having a shiny metal hook for a hand looks incredibly intimidating in storybooks, but in real pirate life it was basically the worst possible tool you could ask for. A pirate ship is an absolute jungle of tangled ropes, massive fishing nets, and swinging sails, meaning a guy with a hook would constantly get himself accidentally stuck to the rigging like a giant idiot. If you tried to aggressively swing your hook during a sword fight, there was a very high chance you would just embed it deep into a wooden mast and awkwardly hang there while the enemy laughed at you. 40. Not all pirates were illiterate thugs looking for rum. Some of them were massive science nerds who just happened to aggressively rob people on the weekends. There were famous buccaneers who used their pirate voyages to meticulously study rare birds, map out unknown tropical coastlines, and write highly detailed botany journals in between threatening merchants with a cutlass. It is an insane reality that some guys were trying to carefully press delicate exotic flower specimens into a scientific journal while standing ankle-deep in rat droppings and smelling like a floating garbage pile. 41. The most fearless outlaws on the ocean would instantly lose their minds and sob like terrified children if the wooden masts of their ships suddenly started glowing with a spooky blue light. This was just a completely natural static electricity phenomenon called St. Elmo's fire that happens during heavy thunderstorms. But pirates were utterly convinced it was the angry, glowing ghosts of dead sailors coming back to curse them. You had giant, heavily scarred men armed to the teeth falling to their knees and aggressively preying on the wet deck over harmless static electricity. 42. Pirate healthcare came with a deeply bizarre compensation plan that basically put an exact price tag on every single piece of your body. The crew's central fund operated with a highly detailed menu stating exactly how much gold you would receive if you accidentally lost a right arm versus a left arm, or a leg versus an eye. It was an incredibly early form of workplace disability insurance where you could sit down and calculate your exact net worth based on how many limbs you were missing before you even raised the anchor. 43. For a bunch of lawless criminals who made a living by aggressively robbing people, pirates had surprisingly strict rules against using foul language or taking divine names in vain. Many famous ship captains literally banned cursing on the deck, and you could be heavily fined or publicly punished just for dropping a bad word during a highly stressful storm. They genuinely believed that swearing would offend higher powers and bring terrible luck down upon the entire voyage. These men were perfectly fine with committing high treason, but they firmly drew a moral line at using inappropriate language. 44. The ultimate life goal for the most fearsome pirates in history was not to rule the seven seas forever. It was to literally beg the royal king for an official apology note. Whenever a royal pardon was publicly offered, thousands of these hardcore rebels instantly rushed to surrender, handed over their rusty weapons, and aggressively promised to become totally boring law-abiding citizens. The golden age of piracy basically ended because the scariest outlaws on the planet all collectively decided they would rather raise pigs and grow cabbages on a quiet farm than spend another sleepless night on a damp wooden plank. So which of these horrific pirate realities would make you instantly quit the crew? Washing your clothes in fermented urine or sleeping next to toe-eating rats? Let me know your absolute breaking point in the comments below. If this video completely destroyed your romantic pirate dreams, destroy that like button and subscribe for more bizarre historical truths. See you in the next one.